Hello again. Just get a little more comfortable. Kathy's told me not to talk too much about the book this time, saying I was flogging it for over 5 minutes on the last video. Well, quite true, but there it is, available at all good Amazon stores near you and rapid delivery. Okay, last word about the book. Let's move on to today's topic. What I'd like to do is talk, if I may, about a man who was not called Ricardo Klement, and how his case has opened up all sorts of questions about the nature of evil that we still have real difficulty in understanding. And personally speaking, I've never found a well written, convincing explanation of this phenomenon. But Ricardo Klement escaped the confusion of post-war Europe using a humanitarian passport, which were issued by the Red Cross. There were a lot of refugees, a lot of displaced people, all of whom had to cross borders to get home. The transport systems were in chaos. So the Red Cross was issuing so-called humanitarian passports, and the one that Ricardo Klement got hold of, he obtained with the help of an Austrian bishop, who will be mentioned briefly a little later on. And on this passport, he arrived in Buenos Aires on July the 14th, 1950, and then he worked a bit, tried to get on, and he was joined in 1953 by the rest of his family. And as I say, he worked through a series of jobs, but it eventually became a department head for the Mercedes-Benz concession in Buenos Aires, and lived in a house that he and his family built themselves on the outskirts of the city. He felt, I think, reasonably safe in Argentina. There were other people like him in a similar situation that formed a sort of network, and these people were, to all intents and purposes, left alone by the Argentinian authorities. But there were people around who were very interested in such people as Ricardo Klement, one of whom, Simon Wiesenthal, had dedicated his life from the end of the Second World War until his death, really, to hunting down escaped Nazis. And he was shown a letter that stated that Adolf Eichmann had been seen in Argentina, but there wasn't much more to work on from this letter. And then in 1956, a guy called Lothar Hermann, a German who'd been living in Argentina since 1938, heard some interesting news. His daughter had been dating a young man in his early 20s named Klaus Eichmann, who, no doubt in a fairly clumsy attempt to impress Sylvia, the daughter, boasted about his father's experiences, his exploits as a Nazi. The girl told her father, and intrigued, Herman sent his daughter back to the boy's house to see if she could find out any more information. And there she met a man who claimed to be Klaus's uncle, but when Klaus eventually turned up at the house, he addressed the man as his father. Well, Herman had already passed on the information he had, that there was a man boasting about his exploits in the war. He'd passed this information on to the Prosecutor General of Hesse, a German state, who in his turn contacted the director of the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad. And the director of Mossad sent agents to Argentina to check on Clement. And it took a while, but finally they made a positive identification. This man, they were fairly certain, was indeed Adolf Eichmann. Now, the Argentinian authorities were very reluctant in those days to consider extradition requests. So the Israeli Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, sent an 8-man snatch squad out to Argentina to bring back Eichmann, who was eventually captured on May the 11th, 1960, was taken to a safe house where his identity was confirmed, and then 9 days later sedated, disguised as a flight attendant, and smuggled onto an Israeli plane. Argentina immediately complained to the United Nations as soon as they heard about it, but the Security Council couldn't really do very much, and Israel was not about to let their prize go. But Eichmann had been lucky up to this point. He'd been imprisoned by United States forces at the end of the war, and again under a false name. But Eichmann heard that his real identity had become known, so he escaped from them. And he was a beneficiary of Bishop Hudal's network of Nazi sympathisers, which smuggled war criminals out of Europe using a network of Catholic monasteries to get people into Italy and then on a boat to South America. Now Eichmann was very high on the wanted list because he had played a leading role in the so-called final solution. He was responsible for managing the deportation of millions of Jews to the ghettos and or from there on to the killing centres in German-occupied Eastern Europe. Given the size of the task, enormous task, and the many other demands made on the railway network, he performed bureaucratic miracles in completing work which has astounded people ever since as an example of pure evil. Now, on April the 11th, 1961, Eichmann's trial began in Jerusalem. The prosecution case took 56 days to present, was carefully constructed, very carefully constructed. Hundreds of documents were used in support of the case, and 112 witnesses were called. In fact, very few of these witnesses actually had personal contact with Eichmann, because he worked behind the scenes on the logistics of the final solution. But Eichmann's involvement in this crime was beyond doubt. So you might have expected a very quick trial, but in a sense, well, not in a sense, actually, this wasn't a trial of Eichmann himself, nor was it just about Nazi Germany. This was a show trial, and something that the chief prosecutor, Hausner, made very clear. It was a trial about anti-Semitism throughout history. Eichmann was, of course, found guilty, and he was hanged on June the 1st, 1962. His last words were supposedly, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the three countries with which I've been most connected and which I will not forget." I greet my wife, my family, my friends. I am ready. We will meet again soon, as is the fate of all men. I die believing in God. Well, it's doubtful perhaps that God at that point believed in him quite so fundamentally. The German Hannah Arendt, who had escaped Nazi Germany before the war and was living in the United States, was assigned to cover the trial for the New Yorker magazine, although it's been said that she only attended the trial for a few days only and relied on transcripts and whatever else she could gather together to write the article. But this report was extended and in 1963 appeared as a book titled Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. And Arendt came in for some considerable criticism for a description of evil as banal, but her critics were, or in some cases, I think, missing the point she was trying to make. She wished to highlight how very ordinary Eichmann appeared to be. Despite his pretensions, he was not very bright at all. He'd not done well at school. He tried to present himself as an intelligent person, but he was not. And he was a person who felt the need to belong to a group which could offer him discipline and a direction. In his case, this group was the SS, and he followed, it seems, all the orders he was given obediently, and it must be said, efficiently. And in fact, at the trial, he did say, "I never did anything, great or small, without obtaining in advance express instructions from Adolf Hitler or any of my superiors." Now, at his trial, and he had, of course, had some 8 years to mull this over, but at his trial he displayed no guilt at all, but neither did he show any resentment of his captors. He seemed to be presenting himself as a bureaucrat who was just doing his job to the best of his ability, and indeed at sometimes seemed to expect people to praise him for how well he had done. So he was obeying the law, and he cited Kant's moral imperative to do so, but either he hadn't understood Kant or he was willfully misconstructing him, because Kant's moral imperative is always superseded, categorical imperative it's usually called, is always superseded by the golden rule that you should always treat people as you would wish to be treated yourself. And you certainly can't say that Eichmann followed that in his treatment of the Jews. But he was obeying the law, he claimed, doing his job, and teams of psychologists examined him, but could find absolutely no trace of any mental illness. He seemed to be a perfectly reasonable person. And Arendt drew the conclusion from this that Nazis were not necessarily psychopaths, and some understood her to mean that ordinary people could and would, given the right incentives or circumstances, commit the most horrible crimes. This is perhaps slightly to miss Arendt's point, because she claimed that even under the most totalitarian of regimes, people still had a moral choice. They could, and some did, even in Germany at the time. One thinks of, for example, the White Rose movement. Some people did exercise that moral choice and rejected the dictates of the regime. Hannah Arendt uses the example of Denmark, which was under German occupation, but flatly refused to follow German instructions regarding the final solution. And indeed, the resistance, helped by many ordinary citizens, managed to evacuate over 7,200 of the 7,800 Jews who were resident in Denmark, and managed to evacuate them to Sweden, which was neutral during the war. You could, I suppose, argue that German rule in Denmark was relatively lightly applied, insofar as that ever applied to Germany itself. And the number of Jews was so relatively low that it wasn't considered a priority compared to the millions who were to fall victim to Eichmann's heartless logistics, some 5 million in all. Of course, by this I don't mean to belittle what the Danes did, but some of Arendt's conclusions have indeed been questioned. A quote from the book, her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, runs, "The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together." Yes. One comment about this is that what Eichmann did as a member of a disciplined group, the SS, makes me believe that his membership allowed him to assume that he was freed from responsibility for his actions, and the freedom to object had been taken from him. I'm running the risk there of oversimplifying Arendt, but surely for some people a situation which allows themselves to be freed from the need to exercise moral choice is a comfortable one to be in. And this, I think, is where we could start a discussion about this without the expectation of reaching any real conclusions. But the Nazi regime is an egregious example of what I think we could all agree was an evil regime. But it's not the only example. Even in recent history, we've seen countless examples of inhumane behaviour. So here's the general question. What is the nature of evil, and why do people acquiesce in it? Okay, I'll over the next couple of days set up a few links to an interesting video about Eichmann, and another on Hannah Arendt, who is one of my favourite 20th century writers. If you get a chance, her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is a good read. It reads like a novel, and it's fascinating throughout its 500 odd pages. As is A Book of Days Winter by me. And thank you very much for your attention. I'll see you next time.
Who's this authoress?
Hannah Arendt.